Hello. This video we're going to be studying the community impacts and social inequalities of agri-food. And the discussion, because of its community focus, is going to start with something called the Goldschmidt Hypothesis. And Goldschmidt performed a study in 1947 for the U.S. Senate and was tasked with studying the effects of changes in agriculture on communities. And this pioneering study wound up paving the way for a pretty large literature investigating this relationship between particularly agriculture and community. Uh, the food piece would come in later. But what Goldschmidt actually provided was an anthropological comparison of two communities, Arvin and Danuba. Arvin was a place where large absentee-owned industrial farms were prevalent, and Danuba was a place where small, local, family-owned and operated farms could still be found. And so we had two very different types of communities here, offering an opportunity to explore the research question. The findings were that the community quality of life was worse in Arvin, the place with the large absentee industrial farms, and the implication was that policy should seek to protect small, local family farms. Although this was an important study, it kind of went unnoticed by scholars in particular for the next 30 years until Rotfeld discovered it and returned attention to not only the study but to the broader research question, examining the community impacts of agriculture. And since that rediscovery, there have been dozens of studies exploring this research question. The Goldschmidt hypothesis um, refers to it. Overall, the research literature is supportive of Goldschmidt's finding, although it's not universal support. There was a meta-analysis conducted in 2008 by Lobeo and Stoffred, and they found, yeah, as we said, overall support, um, but they noted some differences based on the kind of research design that was used in the study. Goldschmidt, of course, used a case study approach, and indeed, most of the other case studies found detrimental effects uh, of large industrial farms, absentee owned. There were two, however, that had mixed findings. Among the macro social accounting approach, which has to do with using available statistics, 12 found a detrimental relationship, but 7 found mixed results, and 8 found no detrimental effect. So that's probably the most troubling of all the methods. Doing a regional economic impact produced similar results as the case studies, 2 mixed results and 3 found detrimental effects. Survey was more consistent with the Goldschmidt expectations, although there was one expectation or one exception, finding no detrimental effects. And then there was a couple of other designs that they reviewed. So 51 studies, 57% more or less supported the Goldschmidt hypothesis. Another 25% somewhat supported it, although with mixed results. And almost a fifth, 18%, found no detrimental effect. So what's going on here? Why the mixed results? Why not 100% support for Goldschmidt? And as we said, the methods used varied quite considerably, and there's disagreements in terms of what's to blame, and we'll come back to that question. But first, let's look a little more closely at some of the effects of this literature, what this literature found in terms of industrial agriculture, which is shorthand for also absentee-owned agriculture and oftentimes large agriculture. So the research literature has found greater income inequality, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of unemployment in terms of the economics. In terms of population, we find declines with class structure tipping towards poverty. We also find social disruptions as far as crime, conflict, other social problems like teen pregnancy, stress, deterioration, breakdown of social relations. Uh, these communities also had fewer community organizations, decreased political decision making at the local level, fewer public services, diminished retail trade, less opportunity recreationally, declining property values, and health. So these are many types of negative outcomes associated with the industrial model. But as we said, returning to the earlier point, maybe one of the reasons these studies are coming to disparate conclusions is because they are putting different amounts of attention on the three dimensions of Goldschmidt, which are the size of farms, so are large farms better or worse than small farms, versus the type of ownership or structure of ownership, which would be, say, family versus corporate owned, and then the locus, or who owns, or where, we should say, where is the ownership? Is it local? So the people who own the farm live in the community, or are they absentee? And if some of the studies may have looked at one or two of these dimensions, some may have looked at all three, some may have only looked at one and ignored the other two, and that could be why we're seeing the disparate findings. Indeed, Labeo and Stoffren called for more careful attention to these dimensions. Now, Wimberly, for instance, found that actually large family-owned farms were more desirable because the families tended to be more prosperous with a larger farm. So small farms are not necessarily better, but family ownership is better. Also, Lyson has found that the key is we need more local ownership, local control. If you live in a community that's declining, you're going to feel more responsible to make some improvements. But if you're an absentee owner, you're far removed from the negative consequences of your farm. You may not care. So, where the owners are was important to Lyson. So those are just some examples of how those dimensions might vary. In terms of public policy, based on their meta-analysis, Labeo and Stoffren point out that we're going in the wrong direction, that policies tend to actually support the industrial model, and SPAT of social science research supports the idea that this is in opposition to good practice. They also, in terms of looking at surveys of public sentiment, find that there is support for local family-owned farms. The public does not really want to see the corporatization of agriculture. In terms of their study, here's a quote, a rather extended quote from Labeo and Stoffren that we should pay attention to. Organizational measures of industrialized farming include vertical integration of corporations into farming, contract farming arrangements, absentee ownership, dependency on hired labor. That's something we haven't really commented much on so far, but is part of the corporate model. The operation by farm managers as opposed to family members, also part of the corporate model. And legal status as a corporation versus, say, a family. With regard to legal status, family and non-family held corporations also need to be distinguished because it is possible for a family farm to become incorporated. So that could also entangle us in some confusion. So we need to focus on all of these careful distinctions when we're studying the Goldschmidt hypothesis. But as far as policy and impact, we need comprehensive measures, according to Labeo and Stoffren, in terms of the socioeconomic, the traditional measures of economic performance, employment, poverty. We need to monitor that. Community social fabric, in terms of stability and quality of life, some of the things we reviewed, and the environment, the quality of the soil, air, water, energy source use, the type of biota in the region, flora and fauna. We must also consider issues of justice and the way different subgroups are impacted. That's where we're going to turn our attention shortly in another video. Uh, and then also make sure we're accounting for both long and short-term consequences. Sometimes it's easy to rush to conclusions looking at a short term when it may just take more time for some of the consequences to materialize. In terms of mediating effects, what can communities do to shelter themselves from corporate industrial absentee farms? Lobeo and Lyson and colleagues suggest having a stronger civil society can act as a buffer. More local focus and control would be emphasized with that. High quality non-farm local employment, so we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. In other words, a more diverse uh, civic capitalism is one of the terms used to refer to that, local community economics. We also need supportive state and local policies in terms of supporting labor and social safety nets, and anti-corporate farming laws in states, especially if we can't get anything done at the federal level. So that's just a quick little review of Goldschmidt. Our next videos will consider some of the impacts of international trade agreements, regional trade agreements rather, as well as biotechnology, and then we'll turn our attention to social inequalities.